The year is 793 AD. On a quiet island off the coast of northern England, monks go about their morning prayers at Lindisfarne Monastery, just as they have for generations. The morning mist rolls in from the North Sea, and everything seems peaceful, ordinary, routine. Then the horizon erupts with dragon-headed ships. Warriors pour onto the beach like wolves unleashed from hell itself. They carry axes that sing through the air, swords that drink deeply of blood, and shields painted with symbols that would haunt Christian nightmares for centuries to come. In a single morning, these raiders don't just steal gold and silver. They steal something far more precious, the illusion that anywhere in Europe is truly safe. This is the moment that changes everything. The moment when the Viking Age explodes into history like lightning splitting an ancient oak. But here's what almost nobody understands about that legendary raid on Lindisfarne. It wasn't the beginning of the Viking story. It was the eruption of forces that had been building for generations in the frozen fjords and windswept islands of Scandinavia. The real story starts decades earlier, in places most people can't even pronounce, with changes so subtle that even the Vikings themselves didn't realize they were about to reshape the entire medieval world. See, everyone thinks they know the Vikings. Horned helmets, which they never actually wore, mindless berserkers, which completely misses their genius for strategy. Savage barbarians, which ignores the fact that they created some of the most sophisticated trade networks, political systems, and artistic achievements in medieval history. The truth is so much more fascinating than the myths. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to trace the complete arc of Viking civilization, from its mysterious origins in the mists of Scandinavia to its transformation into the medieval kingdoms that would dominate northern Europe. We'll see how a collection of tribal societies, scattered across some of the harshest terrain on Earth, evolved into explorers who reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. Traders who established routes from Greenland to Constantinople, and warriors whose descendants would sit on thrones from Dublin to Kiev. This isn't just the story of raids and battles, though we'll definitely cover those. This is the story of one of history's most remarkable transformations, how the Vikings evolved from tribal farmers scratching out a living in the far north into the architects of a medieval world system that connected 4 continents.
And I've spent months researching primary sources, archaeological evidence, and the latest scholarship to bring you details that most documentaries completely miss. We're talking runic inscriptions that rewrite what we thought we knew about Viking society. Recent archaeological discoveries that reveal the true sophistication of their technology, and DNA evidence that's forcing historians to completely reconsider who the Vikings actually were. But before we dive into dragon ships and legendary warriors, we need to understand something crucial. The Vikings didn't emerge from nowhere. They were the product of specific geographic, climatic, and cultural pressures that had been building in Scandinavia for centuries. The raid on Lindisfarne was just the moment when those pressures finally exploded outward into the wider world. So let's go back to the beginning, not to 793, but to the centuries before, when the foundations of Viking civilization were being laid in a landscape that would forge some of the most formidable people in human history. Picture Scandinavia in the 6th and 7th centuries. This is a land of impossible contrasts. Summer days when the sun never sets, winter nights that stretch for months, fjords that cut like sword wounds through mountains older than complex life itself, forests so dense and dark that they spawned legends of gods and monsters that still echo in our culture today. The people living in this harsh paradise weren't yet called Vikings. That term wouldn't emerge for another 2 centuries. Instead, they were known by tribal names that have mostly vanished from history. The Geats of southern Sweden, the Sviar, who would give Sweden its name, the Danes, who were already beginning to dominate the southern regions, and dozens of smaller groups scattered across Norway's impossible coastline. But these weren't primitive peoples struggling for survival.
Picture Scandinavia in the 6th and 7th centuries. This is a land of impossible contrasts. Summer days when the sun never sets, painting the sky in shades of gold that seem to last forever. Winter nights that stretch for months, wrapping the world in a darkness so complete it feels like the earth itself is sleeping. Fjords that cut like sword wounds through mountains older than complex life itself, their waters so deep and dark they seem to hold secrets from the dawn of time. Forests so dense and impenetrable that they spawned legends of gods and monsters that still echo in our culture today. Ancient pines that had witnessed the retreat of glaciers, their branches heavy with snow that never fully melts, and everywhere, always, the sound of water. Streams cascading down impossible cliffs, waves crashing against rocky shores, and the gentle lapping of countless lakes that mirror the aurora dancing overhead. The people living in this harsh paradise weren't yet called Vikings. That term wouldn't emerge for another 2 centuries. Instead, they were known by tribal names that have mostly vanished from history. The Geats of southern Sweden, immortalized in the epic of Beowulf, but lost to time. The Sviar, who would eventually give Sweden its name, ruling from their mysterious halls at Uppsala. The Danes, who were already beginning to dominate the southern regions with their sophisticated political alliances. And dozens of smaller groups scattered across Norway's impossible coastline, the Tronders, the Rogalanders, the people of the western fjords whose very names spoke of their intimate relationship with the sea. But these weren't primitive people struggling for survival in an unforgiving wilderness. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated societies with complex social hierarchies, advanced metalworking techniques, and artistic traditions that produced some of the most beautiful objects of the early medieval period. At Vendel in Sweden, excavations have uncovered warrior graves filled with weapons and armor, so exquisite they rival anything produced in the supposedly more civilized courts of Francia or Byzantium. Helmets adorned with intricate bronze work that depicts scenes of mythology and warfare. Swords with hilts wrapped in gold wire, their blades bearing patterns that seem to flow like water frozen in steel. Shields painted with designs that combined geometric precision with organic curves, creating visual languages that speak of both mathematical understanding and deep aesthetic sensibility. The key to understanding early Scandinavian society lies in recognizing how geography shaped culture in ways that would prove absolutely crucial to everything that followed. In most of Europe, agriculture formed the foundation of civilization. Large, stable populations settled in fertile river valleys, the Loire, the Rhine, the Po, and built their societies around the predictable rhythms of planting and harvest. But Scandinavia was different, fundamentally, profoundly different. The growing season was brutally short, sometimes just 4 months between the last frost of spring and the first freeze of autumn. The soil, where it existed at all, was often poor, scraped thin by glaciers that had retreated only centuries before.
Much of the best agricultural land was scattered across islands and coastal regions separated by mountains that seemed to touch the sky, forests that stretched beyond the horizon, and most importantly, water. Water became the highway system of early Scandinavia. While other Europeans struggled to move goods and people overland through dense forests and across unbridged rivers, the Scandinavians developed boat-building technologies that turned every fjord, every lake, every coastal inlet into a potential trade route. They didn't just adapt to their watery environment, they mastered it in ways that would eventually allow them to navigate from the Arctic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. This maritime focus created a fundamentally different kind of society. Instead of the land-based feudalism that was emerging elsewhere in Europe, Scandinavian communities developed around what we might call naval aristocracies. The most prestigious members of society weren't just those who controlled the most land, but those who commanded the finest ships and could lead the most successful expeditions. The ship itself became the ultimate symbol of status and power, not just a means of transportation, but a statement of identity, a work of art, and a pathway to the divine. When a Scandinavian chieftain died, he might be buried in his vessel, surrounded by weapons, jewelry, and sometimes even sacrificed servants. These ship burials, found throughout Scandinavia, reveal a culture that saw the journey to the afterlife as, literally, a voyage across cosmic waters. The famous ship burial at Sutton Hoo in England, though found on foreign soil, shows the extent to which this maritime worldview had spread. The unknown king buried there was laid to rest with a ship that measured nearly 90 feet long, filled with treasures that spoke of connections spanning continents. Byzantine silver, Frankish gold, Swedish garnets, all brought together in a burial that was simultaneously a grave and a vessel prepared for the ultimate journey. But perhaps the most important aspect of early Scandinavian society was its fundamental mobility. Unlike their European neighbors, who were increasingly tied to specific plots of land through feudal obligations and agricultural necessities, Scandinavian communities remained fluid, adaptable, and always ready to move. A family might farm in summer, when the brief growing season demanded every available hand. They might raid in autumn, when the harvest was complete and the seas were still navigable. They could trade in winter, when ice roads connected previously isolated communities, and they might explore in spring, when melting snow opened new waterways and lengthened days made long-distance travel possible. This flexibility would prove absolutely crucial when climatic and political changes began pushing Scandinavian society towards its explosive expansion. The adaptability wasn't just practical, it was cultural, woven into the very fabric of how these people understood themselves and their place in the world.
The climate shift that helped trigger the Viking Age was subtle but profound. Around the 7th century, Northern Europe began experiencing what climatologists call the medieval warm period. Temperatures rose just enough, perhaps 2 or 3 degrees on average, to extend growing seasons, reduce sea ice, and make previously marginal lands more habitable. For most of Europe, this was simply a period of increased prosperity. Warmer weather meant better harvests, which meant larger populations, which meant more prosperous cities and more powerful kingdoms. But for Scandinavia, the warming was revolutionary. Temperatures that had previously locked northern sea routes in ice for most of the year now allowed navigation for extended periods. Coastal areas that had been virtually uninhabitable became viable locations for permanent settlement. Most importantly, the population began to grow rapidly as agricultural yields improved and infant mortality declined. By the 8th century, Scandinavia was experiencing something it had never dealt with before: overpopulation relative to available resources. But this wasn't the desperate overpopulation of a failing society. This was the dynamic pressure of success, of a culture that had become so effective at surviving and thriving in its environment that it was literally growing beyond the capacity of that environment to contain it. This population pressure coincided with political developments that would prove equally important. Throughout the 7th and early 8th centuries, successful war leaders were beginning to consolidate power across larger territories. The process was slow, often interrupted by conflict and setback, but the general trend was clear. The days of tiny independent chieftains ruling over single valleys or coastal settlements were ending. The age of kings was beginning. In Denmark, the Skilding dynasty was establishing control over vast areas, creating the first truly unified Danish kingdom. In Sweden, the Yngling dynasty was expanding its influence from its traditional base around Uppsala, gradually bringing more and more of the scattered Sviar tribes under central authority. In Norway, dozens of petty kingdoms were beginning the long, violent process of unification that would eventually create a single Norwegian crown. These emerging kingdoms created both unprecedented opportunities and serious problems. On one hand, they could organize larger military expeditions, coordinate more extensive trade networks, and negotiate with foreign powers from positions of genuine strength. The unified resources of an entire kingdom could support projects that no individual chieftain could have dreamed of attempting. But on the other hand, political consolidation reduced opportunities for ambitious young men to achieve status through traditional means. If your local chieftain was now subordinate to a regional king, and that king controlled all the best agricultural land and most of the profitable trade routes, where did that leave the younger sons of ambitious families? Where did it leave the warriors who had previously earned their living by offering their services to competing chiefs? The answer was increasingly clear. Look beyond Scandinavia itself. The same ships that had made Scandinavian society possible, the same navigational skills that had connected scattered communities across vast distances, the same warrior traditions that had enabled political consolidation, all of these could be turned outward toward the wider world that lay beyond the familiar horizons of the north. The stage was set for explosion.
But the Vikings didn't become Vikings overnight. The transformation from tribal raiders to the masters of medieval warfare was gradual, involving technological innovations, tactical developments, and cultural changes that unfolded over several generations. It was a process so subtle that even those living through it probably didn't realize they were witnessing the birth of something that would change the world forever. The most important innovation was in shipbuilding. The early Scandinavians had always been skilled boat builders. They had to be in a land where water was the primary means of transportation. But around the 7th century, they achieved a breakthrough that would change naval history forever. They perfected the clinker-built longship, a vessel that was simultaneously seaworthy enough for ocean voyages and shallow-drafted enough to navigate rivers and land on beaches. Picture the workshops where these marvels were created. Master shipwrights working by the light of oil lamps, their hands moving with the precision that comes from generations of accumulated knowledge. The sweet smell of pine resin mixing with the sharper scent of iron tools. The rhythmic sound of adzes shaping oak planks, each one carefully selected for its grain, its strength, its flexibility. These ships were marvels of engineering that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about working with wood, understanding water dynamics, and balancing the competing demands of speed, cargo capacity, and durability. A typical longship could carry 30 to 60 warriors, travel at speeds that wouldn't be matched by sailing vessels for centuries, and most importantly, appear suddenly wherever there was water deep enough to float it. The clinker-built construction, where each plank overlapped the one below it, creating a hull that flexed with the waves rather than fighting them, was revolutionary.
Unlike the rigid construction methods used in Mediterranean shipbuilding, the Scandinavian approach created vessels that could bend without breaking, that could ride out storms that would destroy more conventional ships, and that could be dragged over land when waterways were blocked or unavailable. But it wasn't just the construction technique that made these ships special. It was their design philosophy. Every element was optimized for a specific kind of warfare that no one else in Europe was practicing. The shallow draft meant they could sail up rivers that other ships couldn't navigate, appearing deep in enemy territory without warning. The symmetrical design, with steering oars at both ends, meant they could reverse direction instantly without turning around, crucial for quick escapes from hostile beaches.
The psychological impact of these ships cannot be overstated. Imagine being a medieval peasant working in fields near a river, secure in the knowledge that any serious military threat would have to approach overland, giving you plenty of warning to flee to the nearest fortified town. Then, suddenly, without any advance notice, a dragon-headed ship appears around the river bend, disgorging armed warriors who proceed to pillage your village before disappearing back into the water system as quickly as they came. This tactical mobility was revolutionary. Previous military campaigns in medieval Europe were ponderous affairs involving months of preparation, slow-moving armies burdened with supply trains, and predictable routes of advance that gave defenders time to organize resistance. The Vikings introduced something new, the lightning raid, appearing from nowhere, striking hard and fast, and vanishing before any organized response could be mounted. The dragon heads that adorned the prows of these ships weren't just decorative. They were psychological weapons designed to strike terror into enemies and project supernatural power. When these carved serpents emerged from morning mist or appeared suddenly around coastal headlands, they seemed like creatures from another world, which, in a sense, they were. But the longship was just one component of a broader military revolution. The Vikings also developed distinctive weapons, armor, and fighting techniques that reflected their unique strategic situation. The famous Viking sword wasn't just a weapon of individual combat. It was specifically designed for the demands of shipborne warfare. It had to be effective in cramped conditions where there wasn't room for lengthy sword work. It needed to be quick to deploy when leaping from ship to shore, and it had to be versatile enough to function both as a weapon and as a tool. The broad, double-edged blade could cut through mail armor or hack through wooden shields. The tapered point could thrust between the gaps in enemy defenses. The substantial hilt provided excellent leverage for both cutting and thrusting. But perhaps most importantly, the sword was perfectly balanced for the kind of close-quarters fighting that characterized Viking raids, quick, brutal encounters where victory went to the side that could deal the most damage in the shortest time. More importantly, the Vikings perfected what we might call amphibious warfare centuries before the term was invented. They understood how to coordinate sea and land operations in ways that multiplied their effective strength. A Viking force of a few hundred men could appear to be everywhere at once, striking multiple targets along a coastline, keeping much larger defensive forces constantly off balance and unable to predict where the next attack would come. They learned to use rivers as highways into the heart of enemy territory, establishing temporary bases that could support extended campaigns far from home. They developed techniques for hauling ships overland when waterways were blocked, for finding and exploiting seasonal variations in water levels, for reading weather patterns and tidal movements with the precision of modern meteorologists. The cultural changes were equally significant. Scandinavian society began to glorify not just courage in battle, which had always been important, but specifically the kind of courage required for long-distance expeditions into unknown territories. The ideal warrior wasn't just someone who could fight well in defense of his home, but someone who could thrive in completely alien environments, adapt to unexpected challenges, and return home with tales of distant lands and exotic plunder. This cultural shift is reflected in the evolution of Scandinavian poetry and storytelling. The older heroic traditions had focused on defending one's homeland, fighting to protect family and community, dying gloriously in familiar surroundings surrounded by kin. These were stories of static heroism, of standing firm against overwhelming odds, of choosing death before dishonor in the traditional sense. But the new stories increasingly celebrated exploration, cunning, and the ability to survive and prosper in strange lands among foreign peoples. The heroes of these tales weren't just brave, they were adaptable. They could speak foreign languages, understand alien customs, form alliances with former enemies, and turn disadvantages into opportunities through quick thinking and creative problem solving. Religion played a crucial role in this transformation. The complex pantheon of Scandinavian deities provided multiple models for how to live a heroic life, and many of these models emphasized exploration and adaptation over simple, martial valor. Odin, the All-Father, wasn't just a war god, but a wanderer who traveled throughout the 9 worlds seeking knowledge and wisdom. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, flew across vast distances each day, gathering information from every corner of existence. Thor, the thunder god, protected the community, but also ventured into Jotunheim to face giants and monsters. His hammer, Mjolnir, was both a weapon of war and a tool of creation, capable of both destruction and blessing. Freyr brought prosperity and peace, but he was associated with the courage to sail into unknown waters, to risk everything on the chance of finding something better beyond the horizon.
These religious traditions created a worldview that saw exploration and expansion not as abandonment of community responsibilities, but as the highest expression of heroic virtue. A young warrior who set sail for unknown lands wasn't deserting his people. He was following in the footsteps of the gods themselves, participating in the cosmic struggle between order and chaos, knowledge and ignorance, the known and the unknown. The combination of population pressure, technological innovation, political consolidation, and cultural transformation created what historians call the Viking explosion. But this explosion needed a catalyst, a specific event or opportunity that would channel all these building pressures into actual expansion. That catalyst came from an unexpected source: the political chaos that was consuming the rest of medieval Europe. By the late 8th century, the continent was fragmenting along multiple fault lines. The Carolingian Empire, despite its impressive territorial extent under Charlemagne, was struggling to maintain effective control over its far-flung territories. The Islamic expansion had disrupted traditional Mediterranean trade routes, creating economic instability that rippled northward. The Byzantine Empire was focused on conflicts in the east, leaving Western Europe increasingly isolated from the broader currents of international commerce. Most importantly for the Vikings, The coastal regions of Western Europe were increasingly prosperous, but decreasingly well defended. The wealth that had accumulated in monasteries, trading towns, and royal treasuries during the relatively peaceful decades of Carolingian expansion had not been matched by corresponding improvements in military preparedness. The very success of early medieval civilization had made it vulnerable to exactly the kind of warfare that the Vikings were perfecting. The Christian monasteries that dotted the coasts of Britain and Ireland represented particularly tempting targets. They were wealthy, having accumulated centuries of donations from pious believers seeking to secure their salvation through generous gifts to the church. They were poorly defended, as monks had no military training and relied on their sacred status for protection. And they were often located on islands or coastal promontories that were perfect for ship-based attacks, isolated enough to prevent quick reinforcement from the mainland, but accessible enough for raiders who controlled the seas. But the monasteries weren't just easy targets. They were symbolic ones. By attacking the most sacred sites of Christian civilization, the Vikings weren't just seeking plunder. They were making a statement about their own power and the weakness of their enemies' gods. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical destruction.
Each successful raid demonstrated that the Christian god could not protect his most devoted servants, while the Viking gods clearly favored their warriors with victory after victory. This had profound effects on both Viking confidence and Christian morale throughout the early years of the Viking Age. For the raiders, each success confirmed that they were on the right path, that their gods approved of their actions, that the wider world was theirs for the taking. For their victims, each attack raised uncomfortable questions about divine protection and earthly power. If God would not defend his own houses of worship, if prayer and piety offered no security against heathen raiders, then what certainty could there be about anything? The raids didn't just steal treasure, they stole confidence, undermining the psychological foundations that held early medieval society together. The stage was set for Lindisfarne. All the pressures, innovations, and cultural changes of the previous century were about to explode outward in a single morning that would echo through history. The ships were ready, the warriors were trained, the targets were identified. The gods, according to Scandinavian belief, were waiting to see what their champions would accomplish in the wider world. But understanding why Lindisfarne became such a turning point requires us to examine exactly what happened on that June morning in 793, and why a single raid on a remote monastery would trigger 3 centuries of expansion that would reshape the entire medieval world. The raid on Lindisfarne wasn't just a military victory. It was a proof of concept that would reshape the strategic thinking of ambitious Scandinavians for generations. But to understand why this single attack became such a turning point, we need to examine exactly what happened on that June morning in 793, and why the Vikings chose this particular target for what would become the most famous raid in medieval history. Word of the attack spread through the fjords and valleys of the north like wildfire. Here was evidence that the wealthy Christian lands to the south weren't just vulnerable, they were practically defenseless against the new style of warfare that Scandinavian innovation had made possible. But the success at Lindisfarne wasn't accidental. It was the result of careful planning, sophisticated intelligence gathering, and tactical execution that revealed just how far Viking military thinking had evolved. The choice of Lindisfarne was brilliant in its calculation. This wasn't a target selected randomly or out of religious hatred. It was chosen according to a detailed analysis that evaluated wealth, defenses, political situation, and escape routes with the precision of a modern military staff. The Vikings were conducting what we would recognize today as detailed reconnaissance missions, often years in advance of actual attacks. Lindisfarne offered the perfect combination of accessible wealth, minimal defenses, and symbolic value. The monastery sat on an island that could only be reached on foot at low tide, making it seem secure to its inhabitants, while actually creating the perfect trap for anyone caught there when Viking ships appeared on the horizon. The monks had grown complacent in their isolation, confident that their sacred status and physical remoteness provided all the protection they needed. But the Vikings had been watching, probably for years. They understood the tidal patterns that governed access to the island. They knew the daily routines of the monastic community. They had identified the locations of the monastery's treasures and mapped the quickest routes to the most valuable items. Most importantly, they had calculated exactly how long they would have between arrival and the appearance of any mainland response. The attack itself was executed with clinical precision that revealed the sophistication of Viking military thinking. The raiders arrived at dawn, when the monks would be gathered for morning prayers in the chapel, unable to scatter and hide their treasures. The timing wasn't coincidental. It reflected detailed knowledge of monastic schedules and a calculated decision to strike when the entire community would be concentrated in a single location. They secured the island's only escape route before beginning the actual raid, cutting off any possibility of flight or outside assistance. This wasn't the work of mindless berserkers, but of disciplined professionals who understood the importance of controlling every aspect of the tactical situation. The systematic looting that followed was equally methodical. The raiders knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it.
The treasures of Lindisfarne represented centuries of accumulated wealth. Gold and silver chalices, illuminated manuscripts bound in precious metals, reliquaries containing the bones of saints, jewelry donated by pious nobles seeking divine favor. But the Vikings weren't just interested in the immediate value of these items. They understood their symbolic significance and the psychological impact that their theft would have on Christian morale throughout Europe. The famous Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the masterpieces of early medieval art, somehow survived the raid, perhaps hidden by quick-thinking monks or simply overlooked in the chaos. But many other treasures disappeared forever, melted down for their gold and silver content, or distributed among the raiders as proof of their victory. The loss wasn't just material, it was cultural, representing the destruction of irreplaceable works of art and learning. But perhaps the most calculated aspect of the raid was its duration. The entire operation probably lasted less than 6 hours. The Vikings appeared with the morning mist, completed their work with ruthless efficiency, and were back at sea before any mainland response could be organized. By the time word of the attack reached the nearest military forces, the raiders had vanished back into the North Sea, leaving behind only smoke, devastation, and the shocked realization that nowhere was truly safe. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Chronicles from across Christian Europe described the terror that the Lindisfarne raid inspired, not just because of the violence, though that was certainly shocking, but because of what the attack represented: the emergence of a new kind of enemy that could appear anywhere, anytime, without warning. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle captures the horror in terms that reveal just how completely the raid shattered existing assumptions about security and divine protection.
In this year terrible portents appeared over Northumbria and sorely frightened the people. They consisted of immense whirlwinds and flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. A great famine immediately followed these signs, and a little after that, in the same year, the ravaging of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne Island by rapine and slaughter. The reference to fiery dragons wasn't metaphorical. To observers on the mainland, the dragon-headed prows of the Viking ships emerging from the morning mist would have seemed like supernatural creatures materializing from another world. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical destruction.
Alcuin of York, one of the most learned men of his age and a former teacher of Charlemagne, wrote letters that reveal the intellectual crisis the raid created for Christian thinkers. How could God permit such sacrilege? What did it mean that heathen warriors could desecrate the most sacred places with apparent impunity? The theological implications were as disturbing as the immediate material losses. But for the Vikings, the success at Lindisfarne triggered what can only be described as a gold rush mentality throughout Scandinavia. Young warriors who had heard tales of the easy plunder and swift victory began organizing their own expeditions. The technology and tactics that had made Lindisfarne possible were rapidly disseminated throughout the warrior communities of the north. Within a decade of the first raid, Viking attacks were being reported from Ireland to the Frankish coast. But these weren't random acts of violence. They were part of a systematic exploration of European weakness that would eventually evolve into permanent conquest and settlement. The raiders were learning as they went, adapting their methods based on what they discovered about European defenses and European wealth. The Irish chronicles provide some of the most detailed accounts of these early raids, partly because Ireland's fragmented political situation made it an ideal testing ground for Viking tactics. The island was divided among dozens of small kingdoms that spent more time fighting each other than preparing for external threats. The wealth accumulated in Irish monasteries was even greater than their English counterparts, having benefited from centuries of relative peace and extraordinary religious devotion. The Vikings approached Ireland methodically, beginning with hit-and-run raids on coastal monasteries, then gradually pushing inland along the river systems. They quickly learned to exploit Irish political divisions, allying with some kingdoms against others, playing local rivals off against each other in ways that maximize their own advantages while minimizing organized resistance. The establishment of long forts, fortified ship camps, marked a crucial evolution in Viking strategy. These weren't just temporary raiding bases, but permanent installations designed to support extended campaigns and protect accumulated plunder. The long fort at Dublin, established around 841, became the prototype for Viking urban development and the foundation of what would eventually become one of medieval Europe's most important trading centers. Raventar, the black pool that gave Dublin its name, provided the perfect natural harbor for Viking ships, but more importantly, the site offered strategic control over the River Liffey, one of Ireland's most important waterways. From Dublin, Viking forces could project power deep into the Irish interior, while maintaining secure lines of communication back to Scandinavia. The transformation of these bases from military camps to commercial centers reveals the most significant development of this period. The Vikings were learning to be more than raiders. They were becoming adaptable colonists who could integrate themselves into foreign societies while maintaining their own identity and independence. This adaptability would prove crucial as Viking expansion encountered increasingly sophisticated resistance. The easy victories of the early raids had been possible partly because European defenders were unprepared for the new style of warfare that longships made possible. But by the mid-9th century, that was beginning to change. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne and his successors began implementing defensive measures specifically designed to counter Viking tactics.
Coastal fortifications were strengthened with new designs that could withstand ship-based attacks. River mouths were blocked with chains and underwater obstacles that prevented Viking ships from penetrating inland waterways. Mobile cavalry forces were organized to respond quickly to Viking landings, denying the raiders the time they needed for systematic looting. More importantly, European leaders began to understand that Viking raids weren't just military problems, but economic opportunities. Instead of simply trying to drive off Viking attacks, some rulers began negotiating with Viking leaders, offering tribute payments in exchange for peace, or even hiring Viking warriors as mercenaries in their own conflicts. This shift from pure raiding to a more complex relationship with European powers marked the beginning of the Viking Age proper. The raiders, who had emerged from Scandinavia as simple predators, were evolving into something far more sophisticated, a new factor in European politics that could no longer be ignored or simply repelled. The transformation is most clearly visible in the career of leaders like Ragnar Lodbrok, whose historical existence remains debated among scholars, but whose legendary exploits capture the essence of this evolutionary moment. Whether or not Ragnar was a real person, the stories told about him reflect the emergence of Viking leaders who thought in terms of kingdoms rather than just raiding expeditions, who understood diplomacy as well as warfare, and who could envision permanent conquest rather than temporary plunder. The attacks on Paris in 845 and 885 to 886 demonstrated this evolution in action. These weren't simple raids designed to grab portable wealth and escape. They were sophisticated military operations that combined siege warfare, diplomatic negotiation, and long-term strategic thinking in ways that revealed just how much Viking military capabilities had evolved since Lindisfarne. The siege of 885 to 886, in particular, showed that Viking forces could sustain complex operations for extended periods, coordinate multiple armies across vast distances, and adapt their tactics to meet the changing responses of their enemies. When the Franks blocked the Seine with fortified bridges, the Vikings didn't simply retreat, they built their own fortifications upstream and settled in for a siege that would last nearly a year. But perhaps the most significant development wasn't military or tactical. It was psychological. The Vikings were developing the confidence and ambition that would drive them to attempt something that seemed impossible to any rational observer: permanent conquest and settlement of foreign territories. The same warriors who had once been content with seasonal raids were beginning to think in terms of establishing lasting dynasties in alien lands. The great Heathen army that would invade England in 865 represented the culmination of this evolution. But it was also the beginning of something entirely new. The Vikings were about to transform from raiders into rulers, from predators into builders of kingdoms. The age of conquest was about to begin.
The transformation from seasonal raiders to permanent conquerors created a problem that no Viking leader had anticipated. Success itself was becoming the enemy of further success. By the middle of the 9th century, the early raids that had seemed so revolutionary were starting to encounter diminishing returns. European defenders were learning to adapt. Monasteries were building stronger fortifications or moving their treasures inland. Coastal communities were establishing early warning systems. Most importantly, local rulers were beginning to organize coordinated responses that could turn Viking mobility from an advantage into a trap. But the Vikings possessed something that would prove even more valuable than their famous adaptability, an almost supernatural ability to recognize when old strategies were failing and completely reinvent themselves before anyone else realized the game had changed. The shift began not with any single decision or dramatic moment, but with the gradual recognition that the future belonged not to raiders, but to conquerors. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 represented the culmination of decades of strategic evolution. This wasn't a raiding force seeking portable wealth to carry back to Scandinavia. This was a conquest army designed to seize and hold territory permanently. Led by figures who claimed descent from legendary heroes like Ragnar Lodbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ube, this force demonstrated that the Vikings had learned to wage war on a completely different scale. The army itself was unlike anything Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. Contemporary chroniclers describe a force that included not just warriors, but siege engineers who understood how to reduce fortified positions, cavalry specialists who could match the tactical mobility of Frankish knights, and most importantly, political advisors who understood the complex web of relationships that held English kingdoms together. But what made this army truly revolutionary wasn't its size or even its composition, it was its strategic vision. The leaders of this force weren't just successful raiders who had decided to try their hand at conquest. They were strategic thinkers who had studied European weaknesses for years and designed their campaign to exploit specific vulnerabilities in English political organization. Their first target reveals the sophistication of their planning. York, Jorvik to the Vikings, wasn't chosen for its wealth or symbolic value, but for its strategic position. The ancient Roman city controlled access to northern England through its position at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss. By seizing York and establishing it as their primary base, the Vikings gained control of the river networks that connected northern England to the sea, effectively cutting off English kingdoms from each other and from potential continental allies. The capture of York in 866 was achieved through a combination of military assault and political calculation that revealed just how sophisticated Viking strategic thinking had become. The city fell not just because Viking warriors were superior fighters, but because the invaders understood English political dynamics well enough to time their attack for a moment when local defenses were weakened by internal conflicts.
Northumbria was in the midst of a civil war between rival claimants to the throne, Osbert and Ella, who had been so focused on fighting each other that they had left their kingdom's primary stronghold inadequately defended. The Vikings didn't just exploit this division, they had probably been monitoring the situation for months, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. But the most brilliant aspect of the Viking conquest strategy was psychological rather than military. Instead of simply trying to defeat English armies in battle, they systematically undermined the ideological foundations that held English society together. Medieval kingdoms weren't just political entities, they were religious communities bound together by shared faith and common allegiance to Christian rulers who claimed divine sanction for their authority. The Vikings understood that destroying this ideological unity was more effective than winning any number of battlefield victories. The execution of King Edmund of East Anglia in 869 wasn't just the elimination of a political rival, it was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of the powerlessness of Christian faith against Viking steel. According to later accounts,
Edmund was killed in a manner that deliberately mocked Christian martyrdom traditions. The details are horrific even by medieval standards, but the symbolic message was clear. The Christian God could not protect even the most pious rulers when they faced the servants of the old gods. The manner of his death sent shockwaves throughout Christian Europe, creating a crisis of faith that went far beyond the immediate political consequences. This psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. As news of Edmund's death spread throughout England, local resistance began to collapse not through military defeat, but through the simple recognition that the old certainties no longer applied. If God would not protect a king who died for his faith, what hope did ordinary people have against these northern pagans who seemed to possess supernatural power? The Vikings reinforced this message by systematically targeting the religious institutions that formed the backbone of English cultural identity. But unlike their earlier raids, which had focused on portable wealth, these attacks were designed to destroy the institutional memory that held communities together. When Vikings burned a monastery, they weren't just stealing its treasures. They were eliminating the schools that trained local administrators, the libraries that preserved legal traditions, and the scriptoriums that maintained the written records that legitimized property ownership and political authority. The famous destruction of the monasteries at Peterborough, Ely, and Croyland wasn't mindless vandalism, but systematic cultural warfare.
The result was a cascading collapse of institutional authority that went far beyond anything that simple military conquest could have achieved. Local nobles found themselves ruling communities that could no longer remember why they owed allegiance to anyone. Peasants discovered that the documents proving their rights to their land had gone up in smoke, along with the monasteries that had preserved them. Into this vacuum stepped Viking leaders who offered something that traditional English authority could no longer provide: effective protection in exchange for loyalty. The Vikings weren't just conquerors. They were presenting themselves as alternative sources of legitimate authority for communities that had been abandoned by their traditional rulers. This approach proved so successful that within a decade of the Great Army's arrival, large portions of England were being governed according to what became known as the Danelaw, legal and administrative systems that blended Scandinavian traditions with local customs in ways that proved remarkably durable and effective. The establishment of the Danelaw represented something unprecedented in European history: the creation of hybrid political systems that were simultaneously foreign and familiar, revolutionary and traditional. Viking jarls ruled English territories using legal codes that incorporated both Scandinavian concepts of personal honor and English traditions of community responsibility. But what made the Danelaw truly remarkable wasn't just its political innovation, it was its economic success. Archaeological evidence from Danelaw territories shows increased trade, improved agricultural techniques, and urban development that surpassed anything seen in purely English regions during the same period. The city of York, under Viking rule, became one of the largest and most prosperous urban centers in Northern Europe. The transformation of York from a declining Roman provincial capital to a thriving medieval metropolis reveals the economic dynamism that Viking rule brought to England. Under English control, the city had been primarily an administrative and religious center, important mainly for its political significance. Under Viking rule, it became a major commercial hub that connected England to trading networks spanning from Iceland to Constantinople. Archaeological excavations in the Coppergate area of York have revealed workshops where craftsmen produced goods for international markets: leatherworking, metalwork, wood carving, and textile production that supplied customers throughout Northern Europe. The scale and sophistication of these operations suggest an economy that was not just recovering from conquest, but actively expanding beyond its previous limits.
The urban centers that developed in Viking territories weren't just larger versions of traditional Scandinavian settlements. They were something entirely new. Multicultural commercial hubs that connected previously isolated regions into integrated economic networks spanning continents. Lincoln, under Viking rule, became a major center for wool production and textile manufacturing that supplied markets from Ireland to the Baltic. Chester developed into a crucial link in the trade routes that connected Wales and Ireland to continental Europe. Even smaller towns like Stamford and Leicester became specialized manufacturing centers that produced goods for international commerce. The transformation of these English cities under Viking rule provides clear evidence that the great heathen army hadn't just conquered territory, it had fundamentally altered the economic and social structure of medieval England in ways that would influence the country's development for centuries. By the end of the 9th century, the success of Viking settlement in England had created a feedback loop that accelerated expansion even further. As news of profitable conquests and successful colonies spread back to Scandinavia, more warriors and settlers were attracted to overseas opportunities. The wealth flowing back from established settlements funded ever more ambitious expeditions to new territories. But this success was also creating new pressures and challenges. The easy targets had been eliminated. The most accessible territories had been settled. The Vikings who sought to follow in the footsteps of the Great Army would have to look beyond England toward territories that would test every aspect of their legendary adaptability. The stage was set for the most ambitious phase of Viking expansion. The movement into the vast river systems of Eastern Europe, the establishment of trade routes that would connect Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, and the creation of commercial networks that spanned 3 continents and forever changed the medieval global economy. The great heathen army had proven that Vikings could be more than raiders. Now their kinsmen would prove that they could be more than conquerors. They could be the architects of a new world order that would reshape the course of human civilization itself.
The rivers of Eastern Europe carved pathways into a world that would challenge everything the Vikings thought they knew about conquest, trade, and survival itself. While their western kinsmen were establishing kingdoms in England and Ireland, other Viking adventurers were pushing east through riverways that led not to familiar Christian monasteries, but to the edges of civilizations so alien and sophisticated that they made European courts seem primitive by comparison. The Dnieper, the Volga, the Don, these weren't just rivers. They were highways into a commercial universe that connected the fur-rich forests of the north to the silk markets of Constantinople and the silver mines of the Islamic world. But navigating these routes required more than longships and battle axes. It demanded diplomatic skills, commercial acumen, and cultural adaptability that would transform Swedish merchants into the founders of the Russian state. The story begins with Swedish traders who called themselves the Rus, a name that would eventually be applied to the vast territories they came to dominate. Unlike their Western kinsmen, who focused on Western expansion, these Eastern Vikings understood that the greatest opportunities lay not in raiding Christian settlements, but in establishing themselves as middlemen in trade networks that already existed between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. But the rivers of Eastern Europe presented challenges that no amount of Scandinavian shipbuilding expertise could solve. The Dnieper alone contained 7 major rapids that required ships to be dragged overland for miles at a time, a process so dangerous that contemporary sources describe it as a journey through the Valley of Death itself. The Volga led through territories controlled by nomadic peoples whose military traditions made Viking warriors look like amateurs. Most daunting of all, successful river trading required maintaining peaceful relationships with dozens of different peoples, each with their own languages, customs, and political systems. The solution the Rus developed was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of trying to control these river routes through force, they would dominate them through a combination of military intimidation and commercial partnership that transformed them from raiders into merchant princes. The process began with the establishment of fortified trading posts at strategic points along the major river systems. Not temporary camps like the Western long forts, but permanent settlements designed to support year-round commercial operations. Novgorod, Kiev, Smolensk, these cities became the nodes of a trading network that would eventually span from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea. The names themselves tell the story of their development. Novgorod, the new town, established where the Volkhov River provided access to the vast Lake Ilmen and the trade routes that led to the Baltic. Kiev, commanding the middle Dnieper, at the point where the great river could be controlled by whoever held the high bluffs on its western bank. Smolensk, positioned where the headwaters of the Dnieper came close enough to other river systems to allow portage between different drainage basins. But the most brilliant aspect of the Rus strategy was their approach to local populations. Instead of simply displacing existing communities, they integrated themselves into local political structures as military elites who could provide protection in exchange for tribute and trading privileges. The Slavic tribes that controlled much of the river territory found themselves with Scandinavian overlords who were more interested in maintaining profitable trade routes than in imposing foreign customs.
This integration wasn't always peaceful. The Russian Primary Chronicle, compiled centuries later but based on earlier sources, describes numerous conflicts between Rus warbands and local populations. But these conflicts typically ended not with the complete subjugation of one side or the other, but with negotiated agreements that established the Vikings as ruling elites within existing social structures. The result was something unprecedented in Viking expansion: the creation of genuinely multi-ethnic states where Scandinavian military leadership combined with Slavic agricultural expertise and nomadic trading connections to produce political entities that were more sophisticated and durable than anything the Vikings had established elsewhere. The transformation of Kiev under Rus rule illustrates this process perfectly. What had begun as a modest Slavic settlement became, under Viking leadership, one of medieval Europe's largest and most cosmopolitan cities. Contemporary accounts describe a commercial hub where merchants from Scandinavia traded alongside Byzantine Greeks, Islamic Arabs, and nomadic Khazars, creating a cultural melting pot that produced innovations in everything from military technology to religious practice. But the real key to Rus' success was their mastery of what we might call violence economics, the calculated use of military force to establish and maintain commercial relationships rather than simply to acquire immediate plunder. A Rus trading expedition was simultaneously a merchant caravan and a military force capable of fighting its way through hostile territory if negotiations failed. This approach proved devastatingly effective when applied to the Byzantine Empire. The famous attack on Constantinople in 860, led by the Rus leaders Askold and Dir, wasn't primarily a raid designed to capture treasure. It was a demonstration of military capability designed to force the Byzantines to negotiate favorable trading terms. Picture the scene. 200 Viking ships appearing suddenly in the Bosporus, the narrow strait that connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. For the inhabitants of Constantinople, the sight must have been terrifying beyond description. No foreign fleet had threatened the imperial capital in centuries. The city's massive fortifications had seemed to guarantee its safety from any conceivable attack. But here were these northern barbarians, sailing their dragon-headed ships right up to the walls of the greatest city in the world, demonstrating that even the Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome itself, was vulnerable to the new style of warfare that the Vikings had perfected. The psychological impact was enormous, not just in Constantinople, but throughout the civilized world. The Byzantine Emperor Michael III quickly realized that it was cheaper to buy off these northern barbarians than to fight them. The resulting treaty established the Rus as privileged trading partners with access to Byzantine markets that had been closed to most foreign merchants. More importantly, the treaty gave Rus merchants access to the vast commercial networks that connected Byzantium to the Islamic world, opening up trading opportunities that would make the Eastern Vikings far wealthier than their Western kinsmen who were still focused on raiding and territorial conquest. The Islamic connection proved particularly profitable. The Islamic world's insatiable demand for northern furs, amber, and slaves created a commercial pipeline that brought Middle Eastern silver floating north through the Russian river systems in quantities that dwarfed anything available through Western European trade. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavian hoards reveals the extent of this Eastern commerce. Swedish museum collections contain literally thousands of Islamic silver coins dating from the 9th and 10th centuries, many of them found in remote locations that could only have been reached through the Russian river routes. These coins represent just a fraction of the total silver flow. Much more was buried and never recovered, melted down for other purposes, or simply lost to time.
The actual volume of trade was probably 10 times larger than what survives in the archaeological record. Contemporary Islamic sources describe Rus merchants carrying so much silver that they hired entire caravans just to transport their accumulated wealth back to Scandinavia. The economic impact on the north was transformational. This eastern silver funded the continued expansion of Viking activity throughout Europe, providing the economic foundation for the great campaigns of the 10th and 11th centuries. But the eastern trade routes demanded more than just commercial skills. They required understanding of Islamic law, Byzantine diplomacy, and the complex tribal politics of the steppes. The Rus who succeeded in this environment had to become cultural chameleons, adapting their behavior and appearance to meet the expectations of radically different societies. Contemporary Islamic accounts describe Rus merchants who had learned to speak Arabic, dress in local fashions, and conduct business according to Islamic commercial practices. These weren't just superficial adaptations. They represented a fundamental understanding that successful long-distance trade required more than superior military technology. It required the ability to function effectively within alien cultural systems. Byzantine sources mention Rus diplomats who understood court protocol and could negotiate complex treaties in Greek. The famous trade agreements between the Rus and Byzantium, preserved in the Russian Primary Chronicle, reveal a sophisticated understanding of international law that rivals anything produced by contemporary European courts.
Most remarkably, some Rus leaders seem to have converted to Christianity or Islam when it served their commercial interests, while maintaining their traditional beliefs in private. This religious flexibility was crucial because the Eastern routes weren't just trading networks. They were corridors of cultural exchange that exposed the Vikings to ideas and technologies that would transform Scandinavian society. The Rus who returned home brought with them not just silver and silk, but new concepts of urban planning, administrative organization, and political legitimacy that would influence the development of medieval Scandinavian kingdoms. The impact is most clearly visible in the evolution of Scandinavian royal ideology during the 10th and 11th centuries. The petty kings who had ruled tribal territories through personal charisma and military success began adopting the trappings of Byzantine and Islamic sovereignty, elaborate court ceremonies, written legal codes, and administrative bureaucracies that could govern large territories without requiring the constant personal presence of the ruler. More importantly, the Rus Vikings learned to think in terms of territorial states rather than personal followings. The Rus principalities that emerged in the 10th century weren't just larger versions of traditional Scandinavian chieftaincies. They were fundamentally different political entities based on control of territory and trade routes rather than personal loyalty relationships.
This evolution is personified in the career of Vladimir I of Kiev, who ruled from 980 to 1015 and transformed the Rus state from a loose confederation of trading posts into a centralized monarchy that rivaled the Byzantine Empire in territorial extent and administrative sophistication. Vladimir's conversion to Christianity in 988 wasn't just a personal religious decision. It was a calculated political move designed to integrate his realm into the broader Christian commonwealth that dominated medieval Europe. But Vladimir's Christianity was distinctively Eastern in character, oriented toward Constantinople rather than Rome, and incorporating elements of traditional Slavic religiosity that would eventually evolve into the distinctive Orthodox culture of medieval Russia. This religious synthesis reflected the broader cultural fusion that characterized the Rus state, where Scandinavian political traditions combined with Slavic social customs and Byzantine administrative practices to create something entirely new. The success of this synthesis can be measured in the durability of the state that Vladimir created. The foundations he laid would support Russian political development for centuries. The Cathedral of St. Sophia in Kiev, built during Vladimir's reign, exemplifies this cultural fusion. The architectural style combines Byzantine techniques with Scandinavian decorative motifs and Slavic construction methods, creating a structure that is simultaneously familiar and foreign, traditional and innovative. The building itself serves as a monument to the cultural creativity that characterized the Rus' achievement. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Eastern expansion was rather economic rather than political or cultural. The silver that flowed north through the Russian rivers funded the continued expansion of Viking activity throughout Europe, providing the economic foundation that enabled Scandinavian rulers to maintain larger military forces, build more ships, and support more ambitious expeditions than would have been possible through Western raiding alone. This economic foundation also enabled the Vikings to weather the increasing resistance they encountered in Western Europe, as their targets learned to defend themselves more effectively. When English kings began building fortified towns and organizing professional armies specifically designed to counter Viking tactics, the Eastern Vikings could continue their expansion because they had access to alternative sources of wealth and power.
The Eastern expansion also provided a crucial demographic outlet that helped prevent the internal conflicts that might otherwise have developed as Scandinavian populations continued to grow. Young warriors who might have competed for limited opportunities at home could instead seek their fortunes in the vast territories opening up along the Russian rivers. This demographic pressure valve was particularly important because it allowed Scandinavian society to maintain its traditional warrior culture while avoiding the internal violence that had characterized earlier periods of population pressure. Instead of fighting each other for scarce resources, ambitious young Vikings could channel their energies into overseas expansion that benefited their home communities as well as themselves. The result was a period of unprecedented prosperity and cultural achievement in Scandinavia itself. The silver flowing back from the east funded monumental building projects, sophisticated artistic production, and the development of urban centers that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. The great trading towns of Birka, Hedeby, and Kaupang became cosmopolitan centers where merchants from across the known world gathered to exchange goods and ideas. By the early 11th century, the eastern expansion had created something unprecedented in medieval history: a commercial network that connected 4 continents and facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies on a truly global scale. Furs from the Arctic tundra found their way to the markets of Baghdad. Islamic silver purchased in Constantinople ended up in hoards buried in Iceland. Chinese silk carried along the steppes routes appeared in Viking graves in Sweden. But perhaps the most important consequence of the eastern expansion was strategic. By establishing control over the river routes that connected northern and southern Europe, the Vikings had positioned themselves at the center of medieval trade networks in ways that gave them influence far beyond their actual military capabilities. Any ruler who wanted to access the wealth of the north, furs, amber, iron, and timber, had to deal with Viking merchants and their political protectors. This economic leverage translated into political influence that extended far beyond the territories the Vikings directly controlled. Byzantine emperors hired Viking mercenaries for their most important military campaigns. Islamic rulers competed for Viking trading partnerships. Western European kings negotiated marriage alliances with Viking dynasties, not just to end conflicts, but to gain access to the commercial networks that Viking expansion had created. The transformation was complete. In less than 2 centuries, the Vikings had evolved from tribal raiders into the architects of a medieval world system that connected 4 continents and created the first truly global economy in human history. But this success was creating new pressures and opportunities that would drive the final phase of Viking expansion into territories that would test every aspect of their legendary adaptability. The stage was set for the most audacious chapter of the Viking story: the westward expansion across the North Atlantic that would carry Scandinavian explorers to the edges of the known world and establish settlements in lands that wouldn't be reached by other Europeans for another 500 years.
While the Eastern Vikings were building their river empires and transforming the commerce of 3 continents, their Western cousins were preparing to attempt something that would have seemed impossible to any rational observer: crossing the North Atlantic in open boats to reach lands that existed only in the fevered imagination of poets and storytellers. The westward expansion began not with grand strategic vision, but with the simple pressure of success itself. By the late 9th century, the most accessible territories in Britain and Ireland had been conquered, settled, or fortified to the point where they no longer offered easy opportunities for ambitious young Vikings. The river routes of Francia were increasingly well defended, And the Mediterranean expeditions that had once seemed so promising were encountering resistance from Islamic fleets that could match Viking seamanship with superior numbers. But the Atlantic Ocean stretched westward into mystery, and Viking culture had always celebrated the explorer who sailed beyond the horizon. The same restless energy that had driven the first raiders to Lindisfarne now pushed a new generation of adventurers toward waters that no European had ever crossed. The key to understanding this westward movement lies in recognizing how Viking society had evolved by the late 9th century. The tribal farmers who had launched the first raids had been replaced by a sophisticated maritime culture that saw the ocean not as a barrier, but as a highway to opportunity. 3 generations of oceanic warfare had produced navigators who could find their way across hundreds of miles of open water using nothing but the stars, the flight patterns of seabirds, and an almost supernatural understanding of wind and current. More importantly, the social pressures that had originally driven Viking expansion were intensifying rather than diminishing. The successful raiders and conquerors of the early period had established themselves as local aristocracies in their adopted territories, but their sons faced the same problem that had motivated their grandfathers: too many ambitious young men competing for too few opportunities. The difference was that this new generation possessed resources and capabilities that their ancestors could never have imagined. The wealth flowing back from eastern trade routes provided the economic foundation for ever more ambitious expeditions. The technological innovations developed through centuries of shipbuilding experimentation had created vessels capable of oceanic voyages that would have been suicide in earlier designs. Most crucially, the accumulated knowledge of oceanic navigation had been refined through generations of Atlantic warfare into a systematic understanding of how to read the sea itself. The discovery of Iceland around 860 wasn't a result of a planned expedition, but rather the inevitable consequence of Viking maritime activity in the northern seas. Norwegian Vikings fleeing political consolidation under Harald Fairhair, Irish-based Vikings seeking new raiding opportunities, and merchants following seasonal trading routes all converged on this previously unknown island that offered something unprecedented in Viking experience: empty land suitable for settlement.
Imagine the excitement that must have swept through the Viking world when the first reports reached Scandinavia. Here was an island larger than Ireland, with grasslands suitable for livestock, rivers teeming with fish, and most importantly, no indigenous population to resist Viking settlement. The volcanic landscape might seem forbidding to modern eyes, but to Vikings, accustomed to the harsh environments of northern Scandinavia, Iceland represented paradise, unlimited land for anyone bold enough to claim it. The initial reports must have seemed too good to be true. Contemporary sources describe explorers returning with tales of an island where steam rose from the ground, where the earth itself seemed alive with elemental forces, where the winter nights were illuminated by curtains of colored light that danced across the sky like the gods themselves, celebrating the arrival of worthy settlers. But these weren't fantasies of desperate men seeking to justify dangerous voyages. They were accurate descriptions of a land that was genuinely different from anything Europeans had previously encountered. A place where geological forces that elsewhere remained hidden were visible on the surface, where the thin boundary between fire and ice created landscapes that seemed to belong more to mythology than to the familiar world of farms and forests. The settlement of Iceland unfolded with remarkable speed and organization. Within 60 years of the first discoveries, virtually every habitable valley had been claimed by Viking colonists, who brought with them not just their families and livestock, but the entire cultural and legal framework of Scandinavian society. The famous Landnámabók, compiled centuries later but based on careful oral traditions, records the names and origins of over 400 original settlers, revealing the scope and systematic nature of this colonization. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing poverty or persecution, but prosperous farmers and chieftains who saw in Iceland an opportunity to establish something that was increasingly impossible in the homeland: independent communities governed according to traditional Scandinavian principles. But Iceland wasn't just another Viking colony. It became something unique in medieval Europe, a society deliberately designed according to principles that had been developing throughout the Viking expansion, but had never been fully implemented in territories where Vikings had to accommodate existing populations and political structures. The Icelandic Commonwealth that emerged in the 10th century represented the ultimate expression of Viking political innovation. Instead of kings or jarls ruling through personal authority, Iceland was governed by the Althing, an annual assembly where free farmers gathered to make laws, settle disputes, and coordinate collective action. This wasn't primitive democracy, but sophisticated republican government that balanced individual freedom with community responsibility in ways that wouldn't be seen elsewhere in Europe for centuries. The legal system that developed in Iceland was equally revolutionary. Instead of royal justice imposed from above, disputes were resolved through complex systems of compensation and arbitration that treated violence as a problem to be solved rather than a crime to be punished. The famous Icelandic sagas, composed generations later, but reflecting this legal culture, reveal a society that celebrated individual honor while maintaining sophisticated mechanisms for preventing feuds from destroying community stability. The saga of Njál, the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, the saga of the Volsungs, these weren't just entertainment, but legal textbooks that taught Icelanders how to navigate the complex relationships between personal honor and social order.
More importantly, Iceland became a laboratory for cultural innovation that would influence all of Scandinavian civilization. Freed from the constraints of accommodating foreign populations or adapting to existing political structures, Icelandic settlers could develop distinctively Viking approaches to everything from architecture to poetry, from agriculture to religious practice. The result was a cultural flowering that produced some of the greatest achievements of medieval European civilization. The anonymous poets who composed the Eddic poems created a systematic mythology that preserved ancient Scandinavian beliefs while transforming them into sophisticated literary art. The skaldic tradition that developed in Iceland elevated praise poetry to levels of technical complexity that rival anything in world literature. The saga writers who emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries developed narrative techniques that wouldn't be matched elsewhere in Europe until the Renaissance. Their understated prose style, their psychological realism, their ability to weave complex family histories into compelling narratives, These innovations established literary conventions that continue to influence storytelling today. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Icelandic society was its relationship to exploration and expansion. Unlike other medieval communities that focused on defending fixed territories, Iceland maintained the Viking tradition of seeing the ocean as a pathway to opportunity. Icelandic farmers who had established successful homesteads continued to launch expeditions westward, driven by the same combination of curiosity, ambition, and demographic pressure that had motivated their ancestors. This westward momentum was more than just adventurous spirit. It was systematic exploration based on careful observation and methodical planning. Icelandic navigators developed sophisticated techniques for reading ocean conditions, understanding weather patterns, and predicting the location of unknown lands based on the flight patterns of birds, the color of clouds, and the subtle variations in wave formations that indicated the presence of distant shores. The Icelandic approach to exploration was fundamentally different from the opportunistic raiding that had characterized earlier Viking expansion. These were scientific expeditions designed to gather information about oceanic conditions, document new discoveries, and establish the foundations for future settlement. The men who sailed west from Iceland carried with them not just weapons and supplies, but the accumulated navigational wisdom of centuries of Atlantic seafaring. Their ships were loaded with everything necessary to establish permanent settlements: livestock, seed grain, tools, and most importantly, the legal and cultural knowledge necessary to create functioning communities in alien environments. They weren't just seeking temporary profit or adventure. They were carrying Scandinavian civilization itself into previously unknown territories.
This systematic approach to exploration reflected the unique character that Icelandic society had developed. Unlike the warrior bands that had conquered England, or the merchant princes who had dominated the Russian rivers, the Icelandic colonists were fundamentally farmers, people who understood that lasting success required patience, planning, and the ability to adapt traditional practices to new environments. But they were also inheritors of the Viking tradition of cultural adaptability and technological innovation. The same flexibility that had enabled their ancestors to thrive in environments ranging from the Irish coastline to the Russian steppes now allowed them to contemplate something that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations: the establishment of European civilization in lands that lay beyond the edge of the known world. The demographic pressures that had driven the original settlement of Iceland were continuing to operate, creating new generations of ambitious young men who found themselves competing for increasingly scarce opportunities in an island that was rapidly filling up with established families and claimed territories. But unlike their ancestors, who had been forced to seek their fortunes through raiding and conquest, these young Icelanders possessed something unprecedented: detailed knowledge of oceanic navigation and the technological capabilities necessary to attempt voyages that would have seemed suicidal just a few generations earlier. The stage was set for the next phase of westward expansion: the discovery and settlement of Greenland, an achievement that would test every aspect of Viking adaptability
and established the foundation for the most audacious voyage in medieval history, the Viking discovery of North America itself. But first, these intrepid explorers would have to overcome challenges that made even the settlement of Iceland seem simple by comparison. The navigation of ice-filled seas, the establishment of communities in an environment more hostile than anything Europeans had previously attempted to colonize, and the development of survival techniques that would allow Scandinavian civilization to take root in a land that seemed to exist at the very edge of the possible.
The westward momentum that had carried Vikings to Iceland led inevitably to the discovery of Greenland around 980 by Eric the Red, whose career exemplifies the complex motivations that drove Viking expansion during this period. Eric wasn't a landless younger son seeking his fortune, but an established Icelandic chieftain who had been outlawed for committing murders in local feuds. His expedition to Greenland was simultaneously exile and opportunity, punishment and potential redemption. The name Eric chose for his discovery reveals the sophisticated psychological understanding that characterized Viking expansion strategies. Greenland was partly accurate. The coastal regions where Vikings could establish settlements did have grasslands suitable for livestock during the brief Arctic summer. But it was also calculated marketing, designed to attract settlers to what was obviously a more challenging environment than Iceland. Contemporary sources describe Eric's deliberate strategy of emphasizing the positive aspects of his discovery while downplaying its obvious dangers. He spoke of verdant valleys sheltered from Arctic winds, of coastal meadows where cattle could graze within sight of ice-covered mountains, of fjords so deep and protected that they remained ice-free even during the harshest winters. He was selling a dream, but it was a dream based on real possibilities for those bold enough to seize them. The Greenland colonies that Eric established around 985 represented the furthest extension of European civilization until the age of Columbus. These weren't temporary outposts maintained by a few hardy adventurers, but permanent settlements complete with churches, farms, and the full apparatus of medieval society transplanted to an environment that tested every aspect of Viking adaptability. Archaeological evidence from these Greenland settlements reveal communities that maintain Scandinavian cultural identity while adapting to environmental challenges that would have defeated less flexible societies. The colonists learned to hunt seals and whales using techniques borrowed from indigenous populations, developed new architectural styles suited to extreme cold, and created economic systems based on trading walrus ivory and polar bear pelts to European markets. The eastern settlement, established near what is now Kasiarsuk, became the administrative center of Greenlandic Viking civilization. Here, Eric the Red built his hall of Bratthalid, where Greenlandic chieftains gathered to make collective decisions according to legal traditions that had been adapted from Icelandic models. The western settlement, located further north near present-day Nuuk, represented the absolute edge of European expansion, a cluster of farms and hunting stations that existed in almost complete isolation from the rest of medieval society. But the most remarkable aspect of the Greenland expansion was its role as a launching point for even more audacious exploration. The same demographic and cultural pressures that had driven Vikings from Norway to Iceland to Greenland continued operating, pushing the most adventurous colonists to investigate rumors of land even further west.
These rumors weren't based on fantasy or wishful thinking, but on careful observation of natural phenomena that experienced navigators knew how to interpret.
Greenlandic sailors had noticed cloud formations on the western horizon that suggested the presence of land beyond the visible range. They had observed bird migration patterns that indicated breeding grounds somewhere across the Davis Strait. Most importantly, they had encountered driftwood of species that didn't grow in Greenland, suggesting the existence of forested lands to the west. The voyages of Leif Erikson around 1000 AD represented the culmination of 5 centuries of Viking maritime development. The ships that carried him across the Labrador Sea to the coast of North America were the product of generations of technological refinement. The navigation techniques that guided him through uncharted waters had been developed through centuries of oceanic exploration. Most crucially, the cultural confidence that made such a voyage conceivable had been built through successful adaptation to increasingly challenging environments. Leif's expedition wasn't a desperate gamble by marginalized adventurers, but a carefully planned exploration launched by one of Greenland's most prominent families. Eric the Red's son possessed resources that his grandfather could never have imagined. Detailed maps of ocean currents, sophisticated understanding of seasonal weather patterns, and most importantly, ships designed specifically for long-distance oceanic voyages. The Viking arrival in North America, Vinland as they called it, marked the achievement of something unprecedented in human history: the creation of a continuous chain of settlements stretching from Scandinavia to the New World, connected by sea routes that Viking navigators could traverse with remarkable reliability. But the North American expeditions also revealed the limits of Viking expansion capabilities. Unlike their previous discoveries, Vinland wasn't empty land waiting for European settlement. It was inhabited by indigenous peoples who possessed their own sophisticated technologies and weren't intimidated by Viking military advantages that had proven so effective against European opponents. The encounters between Vikings and Native Americans, recorded in the Vinland sagas and partially confirmed by archaeological evidence at Lance Meadows in Newfoundland, marked the first sustained contact between European and American civilizations. These interactions were complex, involving trade, conflict, and cultural exchange that challenged both sides' assumptions about the nature of human society.
The Skraelings, as the Vikings called them, possessed military capabilities that were perfectly adapted to the North American environment. Their use of the bow and arrow gave them significant advantages in the kind of forest warfare that characterized conflicts in Vinland. Their superior knowledge of local geography allowed them to launch attacks from directions that Viking defenders couldn't anticipate. Most importantly, their larger population numbers meant that they could sustain losses that would have been catastrophic for the small Viking settlements. The skirmishes that developed between Viking expeditions and Native American communities weren't simple raids that Vikings could win through superior weapons and tactics, but complex conflicts that required diplomatic skills and cultural understanding that the Vikings hadn't needed to develop in their European expansion. More fundamentally, the North American environment presented challenges that even Viking adaptation couldn't fully overcome. The distances involved in maintaining supply lines between Greenland and Vinland stretched Viking logistical capabilities to their breaking point. A round trip between the settlements could take months, depending on weather conditions and ice formation in the North Atlantic. The relatively small population of the Greenland colonies couldn't provide enough settlers to establish permanent communities in the face of indigenous resistance.
archaeological evidence suggests that the Greenland settlements never included more than a few thousand people total, spread across an area larger than modern Norway. This tiny population base simply couldn't support the kind of large-scale colonization that would have been necessary to establish permanent Viking presence in North America. Most crucially, the economic incentives that had driven previous Viking expansion simply didn't exist in Vinland. The wealth that had made Eastern expansion profitable, Islamic silver, Byzantine silk, European tribute, had no equivalent in Vinland. The furs and timber that North America could provide were readily available in Scandinavia itself, often with much less risk and effort than transatlantic expeditions required. Without the economic foundation that had sustained previous Viking colonies, the North American settlements couldn't attract the continuous flow of settlers and supplies necessary for permanent establishment. The saga accounts make clear that Vinland expeditions were often profitable in the short term. The Vikings did find valuable resources and conducted successful trading with indigenous peoples, but they couldn't generate the sustained wealth flows that would justify permanent settlement. The gradual abandonment of the Vinland colonies around 1020 marked not failure, but the recognition of practical limitations that even Viking determination couldn't overcome. The same rational calculation that had made Viking expansion so successful elsewhere now counseled withdrawal from territories that couldn't be profitably maintained. The archaeological evidence from Lonso Meadows tells this story with heartbreaking clarity. Here was a perfectly planned Viking settlement, complete with workshops for metalworking and ship repair, storage facilities for trade goods, and residential buildings designed to house extended expeditions. The site shows clear evidence of several years of occupation and represents a serious attempt to establish permanent Viking presence in North America.
But the settlement was abandoned voluntarily, not destroyed by conquest or natural disaster. The Vikings dismantled their buildings, removed valuable equipment, and departed in good order, the behavior of colonists who had made a calculated decision that their efforts would be better invested elsewhere, not refugees fleeing catastrophic defeat. The failure to establish permanent settlements in North America represented the first time that Viking expansion had encountered limits that couldn't be overcome through adaptation and persistence. But this failure was also a success of sorts. It demonstrated the practical wisdom that had made Viking civilization so enduring. Unlike later European expeditions that persisted with colonial projects long after they had proven economically unviable, the Vikings possessed the flexibility to recognize when strategic goals were unattainable and redirect their energies toward more promising opportunities. But the westward expansion had achieved something that would prove more important than any individual colony. It had demonstrated the extraordinary capabilities that Viking maritime culture had developed over 2 centuries of oceanic exploration. The techniques and knowledge that carried Vikings to North America would continue to influence northern European seafaring for centuries, providing the foundation for later expeditions that would eventually establish permanent European presence in the New World. More immediately, the Western expansion had profound effects on Viking society itself. The successful settlement of Iceland and Greenland created new centers of Scandinavian culture that would preserve traditional values and practices even as the homeland underwent the political consolidation that was transforming tribal societies into medieval kingdoms. These Atlantic colonies also provided crucial economic and strategic resources that enhanced Scandinavian power in European affairs.
Icelandic literary culture produced the historical and mythological works that preserved Viking identity across centuries of political change. Greenlandic hunters provided luxury goods, walrus ivory, polar bear pelts, narwhal tusks that were prized in European courts and gave Scandinavian rulers access to diplomatic and commercial opportunities that otherwise had been unavailable. Most importantly, the Western expansion demonstrated that Viking culture possessed an almost unlimited capacity for adaptation and innovation. The same people who had begun as tribal farmers in the fjords of Norway had successfully established thriving communities in environments ranging from the steppes of Russia to the ice fields of Greenland, from the trading cities of Ireland to the river systems of Eastern Europe.
This adaptability would prove crucial as Viking expansion encountered the increasing resistance that marked the beginning of the end of the Viking Age proper. By the early 11th century, the easy targets had been eliminated, the profitable trade routes had been secured, and the available lands had been settled. The very success of Viking expansion had created a new strategic environment where traditional Viking advantages were increasingly neutralized by opponents who had learned to adapt their own tactics and technologies. The stage was set for the final transformation of Viking society, the evolution from expansionist warrior culture to the medieval kingdoms that would dominate Northern Europe for centuries to come. But this transformation would require abandoning many of the characteristics that had made Viking expansion possible, creating tensions and conflicts that would define the last century of the Viking Age. The great age of exploration and conquest was drawing to a close, but its consequences would reshape the medieval world in ways that extended far beyond the territories that Viking ships had reached.
The transformation that swept through Scandinavia in the early 11th century was as profound as any earthquake, yet it happened so gradually that contemporaries barely noticed the ground shifting beneath their feet. The Viking Age wasn't ended by foreign conquest or natural disaster. It was consumed by its own success, transformed by forces that the Vikings themselves had set in motion centuries earlier. By 1000 AD, the restless energy that had once driven young warriors across unknown seas was increasingly being channeled into a different kind of ambition, the consolidation of royal power within Scandinavia itself. The same organizational skills that had created trading empires stretching from Greenland to Constantinople were now being applied to the more mundane but ultimately more important task of building centralized kingdoms that could compete with the emerging nation-states of medieval Europe. The irony was almost poetic. The Vikings had spent 2 centuries teaching European rulers how to defend themselves against seaborne raids, how to organize professional armies, and how to build fortifications that could withstand siege warfare. Now, they found themselves facing enemies who had learned those lessons all too well, while their own traditional advantages, mobility, surprise, technological superiority, were being steadily eroded by opponents who could match their ships, counter their tactics, and, most importantly, sustain losses that would have broken earlier generations of defenders. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 would become the symbolic end of the Viking Age, when Harald Hardrada, the last of the great Viking kings, fell attempting to claim the English throne that his ancestors had seized with such apparent ease.
But the real transformation had begun decades earlier, in the halls of Scandinavian kings who understood that the old ways of raiding and trading were giving way to new realities that demanded different responses. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark exemplified this transition. His famous conversion to Christianity around 960 wasn't just a personal religious decision, it was a calculated political move designed to integrate Denmark into the broader European community on terms that preserved Danish independence while acknowledging changed circumstances. The runic inscription on the Jelling stone, which Harald commissioned to commemorate his achievements, captures this moment perfectly. Harald Wall, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The phrase won for himself is crucial. Harald wasn't claiming to have conquered these territories through traditional Viking raids, but to have unified them through the more complex process of political consolidation that required diplomatic skill as much as military prowess. The conversion to Christianity wasn't an abandonment of traditional values, but their adaptation to new strategic requirements. Harald understood that Christian Denmark could participate in European diplomacy as an equal partner, while pagan Denmark would always be viewed as a barbarian threat to be contained or destroyed. The choice wasn't between Christianity and paganism, but between integration and isolation. This adaptation process was neither smooth nor uniform across Scandinavia. In Norway, the consolidation efforts of Harald Fairhair and his successors created the very population pressures that had driven the initial Viking expansion, as displaced nobles fled overseas rather than accept subordinate positions in the emerging royal hierarchy. The settlement of Iceland and the discovery of Greenland were both partially the result of Norwegian political refugees seeking alternatives to royal authority. In Sweden, the process was complicated by the wealth flowing in from eastern trade routes, which provided alternative sources of power that could challenge royal authority. The Svear kings found themselves competing not just with traditional tribal chieftains, but with merchant princes whose fortunes were based on commerce rather than land ownership. The result was a more gradual consolidation process that preserved many traditional institutions, even as it created new forms of central authority. But perhaps the most significant change was generational. The warriors who had established the great Viking settlements, the men who had conquered England, founded the Danelaw, established the Rus principalities, and discovered America, were being replaced by their sons and grandsons who had grown up not as landless adventurers seeking their fortunes overseas, but as established aristocrats with inherited positions to defend and expand. These second and third generation Viking leaders thought in terms of territorial states rather than mobile warbands, permanent institutions rather than personal relationships, administrative efficiency rather than heroic achievement. The evolution is most clearly visible in the career of Canute the Great, who ruled England, Denmark, and Norway simultaneously in the early 11th century. Canute was recognizably a Viking leader. He had seized the English throne through military conquest and maintained his power through a combination of Danish supporters and Anglo-Saxon administrators. But his methods of governance were fundamentally different from those of earlier Viking conquerors. Where previous Viking leaders ruled through personal charisma and the distribution of plunder, Canute established bureaucratic institutions that could function without his constant presence.
Where earlier Vikings had maintained their power through the threat of renewed raiding, Canute derived his authority from legal frameworks that integrated Scandinavian and English traditions. Most importantly, where traditional Viking leadership had been essentially military in character, Canute's authority was fundamentally administrative, based on his ability to provide effective government rather than successful warfare. This shift from military to administrative leadership reflected broader changes in the nature of political power throughout medieval Europe. The feudal systems that were emerging in France and Germany required rulers who could manage complex networks of personal relationships, legal obligations, and territorial rights. The Byzantine Empire that controlled the eastern trade routes demanded diplomatic partners who understood court protocol and commercial law. Even the Islamic powers that had provided so much of the silver that funded Viking expansion expected to deal with stable governments rather than opportunistic raiders. The Vikings who succeeded in this new environment were those who could adapt their traditional skills to meet these changed expectations. The same strategic thinking that had made them master raiders now made them effective diplomats. The organizational abilities that had enabled them to coordinate complex expeditions across thousands of miles now served them in managing territorial administrations. The cultural flexibility that had allowed them to integrate into societies from Dublin to Kiev now helped them navigate the increasingly complex world of medieval international relations. But this adaptation came at a cost that many traditional Vikings found unacceptable. The warrior culture that had celebrated individual achievement and personal freedom was giving way to hierarchical systems that emphasized collective responsibility and institutional loyalty. The egalitarian assemblies that had governed early Viking expeditions were being replaced by royal courts, where access to power depended on birth and appointment rather than merit and courage. The resistance to these changes took many forms, from the traditional conservatism of Icelandic society to the violent rebellions that periodically convulsed Norway and Sweden. But perhaps the most significant resistance came from the Viking communities that had established themselves outside Scandinavia, where traditional values could be preserved even as the homeland underwent political transformation.
The Varangian Guard that served Byzantine emperors throughout the 11th and 12th centuries represented one form of this resistance. These were Scandinavian warriors who had chosen to maintain their traditional military culture by serving foreign rulers rather than accept subordinate positions in the emerging royal hierarchies of their homelands. Their legendary loyalty to the Byzantine throne wasn't just professional dedication, it was a conscious rejection of the political changes that were transforming Viking society. By serving an emperor who valued their traditional warrior skills above their ability to adapt to new administrative requirements, the Varangians could maintain their identity as warriors in an age that increasingly demanded bureaucrats. Similarly, the Scandinavian communities in Russia maintained distinctively Viking characteristics long after their cousins in the West had been absorbed into medieval European civilization. The trade routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea continued to be dominated by merchants who combined traditional Viking seamanship with sophisticated commercial practices, creating hybrid cultures that preserved essential elements of the old warrior ethos within new economic frameworks. But the most important form of resistance was cultural rather than political. The literary traditions that flourished in Iceland during the 12th and 13th centuries represented a systematic attempt to preserve the memory of Viking values and achievements, even as the political structures that had created those achievements were disappearing. The authors of these works understood that they were witnessing the end of an era, and they worked systematically to preserve its memory for future generations who might otherwise forget what their ancestors had accomplished. The Heimskringla, attributed to Snorri Sturluson but reflecting broader cultural concerns, begins with the explicit recognition that the age of heroes was ending, and that future generations would need written records to understand the achievements of their ancestors. The saga writers weren't just storytellers, they were cultural archivists working to preserve a way of life that was vanishing before their eyes. This literary preservation project was remarkably successful. The images of Viking culture that dominate modern popular imagination, the emphasis on individual heroism, the celebration of exploration and adventure, the complex honor codes that balanced personal ambition with community loyalty, derive largely from these medieval Icelandic texts rather than from contemporary sources from the height of the Viking Age itself.
But the saga tradition also reveals the profound ambivalence that many Scandinavians felt about the transformation of their society. The heroes of these stories are typically men who lived according to traditional values in a world that was changing around them. Often tragic figures whose adherence to ancient codes brought them into conflict with new realities they couldn't fully understand or accept. The saga of the Volsungs, the saga of Níl, the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson. These aren't simple adventure stories, but complex meditations on the tension between individual freedom and social responsibility, between traditional honor and practical necessity, between the heroic ideals of the past and the administrative requirements of the present. The economic foundations of this cultural transformation were as important as the political and military changes. The wealth that had flowed into Scandinavia through 2 centuries of raiding and trading had created new social classes with different interests and priorities than the warrior aristocracies that had dominated earlier Viking society. Merchants who had accumulated fortunes through long-distance trade were more interested in maintaining stable political conditions that protected their investments than in supporting military adventures that might disrupt profitable commercial relationships. Craftsmen who had developed sophisticated techniques for working imported materials wanted predictable supplies of raw materials rather than the irregular windfalls that came from successful raids. Farmers who had improved their agricultural techniques using wealth acquired overseas preferred the security that came from strong royal protection to the independence that had characterized traditional Viking communities. These new social groups provided the foundation for the monarchical systems that emerged throughout Scandinavia during the 11th and 12th centuries. They had economic interests that aligned with royal policies designed to promote trade, maintain order, and establish diplomatic relationships with neighboring powers. Most importantly, they possessed the administrative skills necessary to implement the bureaucratic systems that effective royal government required. The result was a fundamental shift in the relationship between rulers and subjects throughout Scandinavian society. Where traditional Viking leaders had been essentially military commanders who derived their authority from successful warfare,
The new royal dynasties were territorial sovereigns whose power rested on their ability to provide administrative services and maintain economic prosperity. This transformation is most clearly visible in the evolution of urban centers throughout Scandinavia. The trading posts that had emerged during the height of Viking expansion, Birka, Hedeby, Kaupang, were gradually replaced by new cities that were designed according to medieval European models rather than traditional Scandinavian patterns. Stockholm, Oslo, Bergen. These weren't just larger versions of earlier Viking settlements, but fundamentally different kinds of communities, organized around different principles and serving different functions. They were administrative centers where royal officials collected taxes and enforced royal law, commercial hubs where international merchants conducted business according to standardized procedures, and cultural centers where new forms of art and literature reflected the integration of Scandinavian traditions with broader European developments. The architectural evolution of these cities reveals the broader cultural transformation that was occurring throughout Scandinavian society. The wooden halls that had housed Viking chieftains were being replaced by stone castles built according to continental models. The simple churches that had marked the initial conversion to Christianity were giving way to elaborate cathedrals that demonstrated royal piety and artistic sophistication.
Most significantly, the irregular layouts that had characterized earlier settlements were being replaced by planned street systems that reflected new concepts of urban organization and social hierarchy. The organic growth patterns that had defined Viking settlements were giving way to systematic planning that prioritized administrative efficiency over traditional community relationships. But perhaps the most important change was linguistic. The Old Norse that had served as the common language of Viking expansion was gradually fragmenting into the distinct national languages that would define medieval Scandinavian identity. Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian were emerging as separate linguistic traditions that reflected the political boundaries that were dividing the former Viking world into distinct kingdoms. This linguistic fragmentation was both cause and consequence of the political consolidation that was transforming Scandinavian society. Royal courts needed standardized languages for administrative purposes, while the development of distinct national identities required linguistic markers that could distinguish between different peoples who had previously shared common cultural traditions. The religious transformation that accompanied these political and cultural changes was equally profound. The conversion to Christianity that had begun as a diplomatic necessity was evolving into a genuine cultural synthesis that created distinctively Scandinavian forms of medieval Christianity. The stave churches that were constructed throughout Norway during the 12th and 13th centuries exemplify this synthesis. These remarkable buildings combined traditional Scandinavian woodworking techniques with Christian architectural symbolism, creating structures that were simultaneously ancient and modern, pagan and Christian, distinctively Nordic and broadly European. The success of this transformation is evident in the remarkable stability that characterized Scandinavian society during the later medieval period. The kingdoms that emerged from the consolidation of Viking territories proved remarkably durable, surviving political crises and external threats that destroyed many of their European contemporaries. But this stability came at the cost of the dynamic energy that had driven Viking expansion in the first place.
the restless ambition that had driven Scandinavian warriors across unknown seas was channeled into more predictable pursuits: territorial administration, commercial development, and cultural refinement. The Viking Age was ending, not with defeat, but with victories so complete that it transformed the victors themselves into something entirely different from what they had been before.
The same openness to foreign ideas that had allowed Scandinavian traders to learn Arabic numerals, Byzantine commercial law, and Islamic navigation techniques now enabled European scholars to integrate classical knowledge, Arabic science, and empirical observation into new intellectual frameworks that would transform human understanding of the natural world. The university systems that spread throughout Europe during the High Middle Ages reflected organizational principles that had been developing since the first Viking expeditions learned to coordinate complex activities across vast distances. The academic networks that connected scholars from Oxford to Prague, from Paris to Krakow, operated according to communication protocols that echoed the information systems that had enabled Viking traders to maintain commercial relationships from Dublin to Constantinople. But the most remarkable continuity was psychological rather than institutional. The intellectual courage that drove medieval scholars to question established authorities, to propose new explanations for natural phenomena, to imagine alternative ways of organizing human society. This reflected the same willingness to challenge conventional limitations that had originally motivated Scandinavian farmers to sail beyond familiar horizons in search of opportunities that might or might not exist. The scientific revolution that would transform European understanding of the physical universe during the 16th and 17th centuries had its conceptual roots in this Viking-inherited tradition of empirical investigation and practical experimentation. The same methodological approaches that had enabled Scandinavian navigators to develop sophisticated understanding of ocean currents, wind patterns, and celestial movements now guided European natural philosophers as they attempted to decode the mathematical principles that governed planetary motion, chemical reactions, and biological processes. When Galileo pointed his telescope toward the heavens and discovered that the moon had mountains, that Jupiter had satellites, that the Milky Way consisted of countless individual stars, he was employing observational techniques that had been refined through centuries of Scandinavian maritime exploration. The careful documentation of phenomena, the systematic comparison of observations, the willingness to accept evidence that contradicted established beliefs, all of these methodological principles had been developing since Viking explorers first began mapping unknown coastlines and recording the characteristics of unfamiliar territories. The political innovations that would reshape European governance during the early modern period similarly reflected the continuing influence of Scandinavian institutional traditions. The parliamentary systems that began emerging throughout Northern Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries weren't simply responses to immediate political pressures. They were institutional expressions of participatory decision-making traditions that traced back to the Thing assemblies where Viking communities had debated collective policies. The concept of representative government that would eventually transform political organization throughout the Western world
had its practical origins in the governance systems that Viking settlers had developed to manage their overseas colonies. The same principles that had enabled Icelandic farmers to create the Althing, Greenlandic colonists to coordinate their activities without royal supervision, and Rus traders to establish effective administration across the vast river systems of Eastern Europe, now provided conceptual foundations for the political experiments that would define modern democratic institutions.
The economic theories that began emerging during the late medieval period reflected an equally profound debt to Viking commercial innovations. The understanding of markets as self-regulating systems, the recognition that competition could produce benefits for entire societies rather than just individual participants, the sophisticated analysis of supply and demand relationships, all of these insights had been developing since Scandinavian merchants first began operating in the complex international networks that connected Northern Europe to Byzantium and the Islamic world. The banking systems that enabled the commercial revolution of the High Middle Ages were direct descendants of the credit networks that Viking traders had established to manage long-distance transactions. The insurance mechanisms that made oceanic commerce economically viable reflected risk assessment techniques that had been refined through centuries of Scandinavian maritime enterprise. The accounting methods that allowed medieval businesses to track complex international operations evolved from the record-keeping systems that Viking expeditions had developed to manage multi-year trading voyages. But perhaps the most significant legacy was cultural rather than institutional or technological. The Viking transformation had demonstrated that human societies possessed an almost unlimited capacity for adaptation and innovation when circumstances demanded creative responses to new challenges. This insight had become so thoroughly integrated into European consciousness that it shaped responses to every subsequent crisis or opportunity. When the Black Death devastated European populations during the 14th century, the regions that recovered most successfully were those that had inherited Viking traditions of social mobility and economic flexibility. When the Ottoman expansion threatened traditional trade routes during the 15th century, the societies that developed the most effective alternatives were those that possessed Viking-derived experience in long-distance commerce and cultural adaptation. When the discovery of the Americas created unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion during the 16th century, the European powers that proved most successful at colonial enterprise were those that had learned the lessons that Viking settlers had been teaching for 7 centuries. The patterns were consistent across different periods and contexts because they reflected deep cultural assumptions about the nature of human capability and the possibilities for social transformation. The same worldview that had enabled a few thousand Scandinavian farmers to reshape medieval Europe now allowed European civilization as a whole to extend its influence throughout the globe. As the 16th century dawned and European explorers began establishing permanent settlements in the Americas, they carried with them not just superior military technology and epidemic diseases, but also intellectual frameworks and institutional models that had been developing since the first Viking expeditions had demonstrated that small groups of determined individuals could establish successful communities in previously unknown territories.
The Spanish conquistadors who toppled the Aztec and Inca empires weren't just employing military tactics. They were implementing strategies of cultural adaptation and alliance building that echoed techniques that Viking leaders had used to establish their authority over much larger indigenous populations in Ireland, England, and Russia. The Portuguese traders who established commercial networks throughout the Indian Ocean weren't simply following established routes. They were creating new forms of international commerce that reflected organizational principles that Scandinavian merchants had been developing for centuries. The English colonists who established permanent settlements along the North American coast weren't just seeking religious freedom or economic opportunity. They were participating in a tradition of overseas expansion that had been continuous since the first Viking families had sailed west from Norway to establish new communities in Iceland and Greenland. The transformation was complete, yet it continued. The Viking Age had ended, but the age of global European expansion that it had made possible was just beginning. The longships had evolved into galleons and frigates. The warrior bands had become professional armies and colonial administrations. The trading posts had grown into global commercial empires. But the essential spirit remained unchanged, the conviction that human intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle, that cultural boundaries could be crossed and traditional limitations transcended, that the world was a place of unlimited opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. The greatest Viking voyage was not to Iceland or Greenland or even North America. It was the journey from tribal obscurity to global influence, from local significance to universal legacy, from the margins of history to the very center of human development. That journey had transformed not just the Vikings themselves, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. As we stand at our own historical moment, surrounded by technologies and possibilities that medieval minds could never have imagined, we remain the inheritors of that original Viking insight, that the world has no fixed boundaries, that human societies can adapt to any challenge, that the horizon is not a limit, but an invitation. The dragon ships have long since rotted away, but their legacy sails on in every human enterprise that dares to venture beyond the familiar, to explore the unknown, to believe that tomorrow can be fundamentally different from today. The Viking Age was a chapter in human history, but the story it began will continue as long as human beings possess the courage to explore, the wisdom to adapt, and the vision to imagine possibilities beyond the limits of their current circumstances. The greatest conquest of the Vikings was not any territory they seized, but the expansion of human imagination itself. And that conquest, unlike all the others, truly was eternal. The echoes of Viking achievement ripple through time like stones cast into still water, each circle expanding wider than the last. In the merchant districts of medieval London, where traders from across the known world haggled over prices in a dozen languages, the organizational principles that governed their commerce traced directly back to the trading protocols that Viking merchants had established centuries earlier. The letters of credit that enabled a Flemish wool merchant to conduct business with a Novgorod fur trader without ever meeting face to face. These were refinements of trust networks that Scandinavian adventurers had pioneered when they first realized that reputation could be more valuable than sword strength. But perhaps the most profound transformation was invisible, woven so deeply into the fabric of European consciousness that contemporaries barely noticed its presence. The medieval mind that could conceive of sending ships beyond the edge of the known world, that could imagine profits from ventures that might not return for years, that could envision political alliances spanning continents.
This was a mental landscape that the Vikings had created through their relentless expansion of what seemed possible for human beings to achieve. When Christopher Columbus stood on the deck of the Santa Maria in 1492, staring into the Atlantic vastness that stretched toward an uncertain horizon, he carried with him more than Spanish royal commissions and Italian ambitions. He carried the accumulated wisdom of generations of northern seafarers who had learned to read the ocean's moods, to trust their vessels to waters that had never known human presence, to believe that courage and skill could bridge any gap between the known and the unknown. The navigational techniques that guided his ships westward had been refined in the cold waters of Iceland and Greenland. The mental frameworks that allowed him to imagine reaching Asia by sailing west reflected a geographic understanding that Viking explorers had been developing for 5 centuries. Most crucially, the simple conviction that the ocean was a pathway rather than a barrier embodied a worldview that had been forged in the fjords of Norway and tested in the storms of the North Atlantic. Yet Columbus himself probably never consciously connected his enterprise to Viking precedents. The transformation had been so complete, so thoroughly integrated into European culture, that its origins had become invisible. The same process that had converted Danish raiders into English kings, Swedish adventurers into Russian princes, and Norwegian farmers into Icelandic republicans had now elevated their collective achievements into universal human capabilities. This invisibility was perhaps the ultimate measure of Viking success. They had not simply conquered territories or accumulated wealth. They had expanded the boundaries of human imagination itself. The idea that ordinary people could cross vast distances, adapt to alien environments, and create new forms of civilization in previously empty lands had evolved from a distinctly Scandinavian innovation into a fundamental assumption of European culture. The implications extended far beyond exploration and commerce. The same mental flexibility that had enabled Vikings to thrive in environments ranging from the Russian steppes to the Greenlandic icefields now allowed European societies to adapt to challenges that would have paralyzed more rigid civilizations. When the Ottoman Empire closed traditional trade routes to Asia in the 15th century, European merchants didn't simply accept the loss. They innovated alternative pathways that would ultimately prove more profitable than the original connections. When the printing press began revolutionizing the spread of information, the societies that adapted most quickly and effectively were those that had inherited Viking traditions of cultural synthesis and technological innovation.
And so we return to where we began, to that quiet island off the coast of northern England where everything changed on a June morning in 793. But now, as you drift toward sleep, imagine Lindisfarne today. The morning mist still rolls in from the North Sea, just as it did 12 centuries ago. But instead of dragon-headed ships emerging from that silvery veil, you might see fishing boats returning with their catch, or perhaps a ferry carrying tourists who come to walk where history was made. The monastery has been rebuilt, its stones carefully arranged by archaeologists who study fragments of pottery and rusted iron to understand what happened on that long-ago morning. Where once monks cowered in terror at the sound of foreign voices, now visitors from around the world gather to learn about the people who changed everything. The gift shop sells replica Viking jewelry and children's books about exploration and adventure. The museum displays artifacts that tell the story we've just shared, fragments of swords that once sang through morning air, pieces of ships that carried dreamers across impossible distances,
coins that traveled from the markets of Baghdad to be buried in the soil of Scandinavia. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about modern Lindisfarne is what you can't see. The terror is gone. The incomprehension has faded into academic curiosity. The clash of civilizations has become a story we tell our children to help them understand that the world is larger and more wondrous than they ever imagined. Standing on that beach today, watching the tide ebb and flow across the same causeway that the Vikings crossed, you might hear something in the wind. Not the war cries of ancient raiders, but the whisper of all the journeys that followed. The expeditions that discovered continents, the voyages that connected worlds, the migrations that carried human dreams to every corner of the earth. The Vikings taught us that the horizon is not a boundary, but a promise, that the unknown is not a threat, but an opportunity, and that human beings are not prisoners of their circumstances, but architects of their own destinies.
Tonight, as you close your eyes and let your mind drift across the North Atlantic, following the wake of those ancient ships, you carry with you the same spirit that drove Leif Erikson toward an undiscovered continent, that inspired Eric the Red to see paradise in a land of ice, that convinced countless unnamed sailors that what lay beyond the edge of the map was worth any risk to discover. You are the heir to their restlessness, their curiosity, their unshakable belief that tomorrow could be better than today if you had the courage to sail toward it. In your dreams tonight, you might find yourself standing on the deck of a longship, feeling the salt spray on your face and the endless possibilities stretched out before you like an ocean that has no farther shore. The dragon ships are gone, but their spirit lives on in every person who looks beyond familiar horizons and dares to imagine that the world could be different than it is, better than it has been, greater than anyone has previously thought possible. The Viking Age ended 1,000 years ago, but the age of exploration, the age of possibility, the age of believing that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things, that age will last as long as there are humans who understand that the horizon is not where the world ends, but where it begins anew. Sweet dreams, fellow traveler. Dream of distant shores and impossible journeys, and remember that the greatest adventure is always the one that begins when you open your eyes tomorrow and decide that the world is still full of wonders waiting to be discovered. The Viking Age ended 1,000 years ago, but the age of exploration, the age of possibility, the age of believing that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things, that age will last as long as there are humans who understand that the horizon is not where the world ends, but where it begins anew.